Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. On October 31st, South Sudanese rebel leader Riek Machar entered the capital city of Juba for the first time in 2 years. He was there for a peace ceremony. Earlier this summer, Machar and South Sudanese President Salva Kiir signed a peace deal, formally ending a civil war that killed hundreds of thousands of people and displaced over 1 million more. The ceremony in Juba was intended as a confidence-building measure toward the implementation of the peace deal. On the line with me to discuss the peace deal is Alan Boswell. He is a senior analyst at the International Crisis Group who has been following events in South Sudan for years. We discuss the roots of the conflict, what led to this peace agreement, and whether or not this agreement can succeed. A quick note before we begin, this episode came about because Alan Boswell is a listener to the show, and it's a good reminder that you should reach out to me if there's an interesting topic you think should be shared with this community of listeners and beyond. And this community is strong. People who listen to this show more or less have a professional interest in wanting to more deeply understand the context of issues in global affairs. This is particularly true of the kinds of issues we highlight on this show, which tend to be around topics that don't often make the headlines and are not often the subject of sustained attention from the mainstream media. In short, this is a community of impact, and if you want to reach this community, then reach out to me. You can do so using the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com. All right, now here is my conversation with Alan Boswell of the International Crisis Group.
Right, so this is actually the second peace deal that's been signed since South Sudan fell into civil war in 2013, and the reason that this recent peace celebration in Juba was so significant was because during the first one, Riek Machar, the rebel leader, came to Juba, and there ended up being clashes within a few weeks of him arriving and taking up the post of vice presidency, and then he was chased out of the country. So him coming back, which he did once again to Juba, was seen as a sign of that this time they might be serious. There was some concern originally that he wasn't going to come back at all.
He was basically in exile, right, in the DRC?
So he fled into Congo, and then this was back in 2016. He wasn't there very long. Actually, the UN had to evacuate him, and then he was flown to Sudan. And then from Sudan, he went on a medical visit to South Africa and then was put under house arrest in South Africa. Then he was where he was for over a year. Then when the peace talks restarted, he was allowed back into the region, and now he's basically based out of Khartoum in Sudan.
Okay, but it was significant that he was allowed back in Juba. But we're speaking in early November. Is he still there now, or is he sort of back in Khartoum at this point?
No, so he's back in Khartoum. He just came for the day. The significance was that it wasn't clear for a while whether or not the South Sudan government would allow him to come back. But it was also unclear if he himself would feel comfortable coming back, given that last time he was chased out of the country. I should say the peace celebration was attended by the heads of state of Sudan and Uganda, as well as other regional heads of state. And really, Sudan and Uganda really kind of led this peace effort. And they are the two main external parties to the war. And so that was a huge part of this peace celebration, too, was having President Bashir from Sudan and President Museveni of Uganda there as well.
So I want to focus much of our conversation on this peace deal, whether or not it will endure, what elements made it success. But before we get there, I'd love to have you explain the roots of this conflict, which, as you said, broke out in 2013 and sort of descended and became one of the region's worst conflicts and most awful humanitarian crises as well that's ongoing to this day. But can you sort of take us back to 2013 and sort of set the scene for how this conflict erupted initially?
Right. Well, so South Sudan achieved its independence in 2011, and of course there's a lot of hope. I was there at the time, actually working as a journalist, and an extreme amount of hope. And also there was a large U.S. backing for that effort. In 2013, the ruling party, the SPLM, which sort of had a monopoly on power in South Sudan after independence, a war broke out basically between leaders of the two main ethnic groups over a battle over who would be the chairman of the SPLM party, and then would more or less de facto be assumed to be the next president of the country. Because whoever was the chairman was presumed to win the election. So
kind of like a one-party state. This was like the Liberation Party, so it had like by far the most political popular support. This was the party,
right? And essentially what happened is during the Liberation War, actually more South Sudanese killed each other than actually North Sudanese did. It was both a North-South war to a degree. It was also a South-South war oftentimes within South Sudan. And so to a certain degree, when South Sudan achieved independence, that the war between North Sudan and South Sudan was over, but the internal issues within South Sudan was never really resolved. So a lot of these issues got postponed until after independence. There was sort of an agreed upon truce among South Sudanese because they all wanted independence essentially, but to sort of resolve their own power struggles to push back their own power struggles until after independence. And then that really came to fruition quite quickly, actually, after achieving independence, and unfortunately, and then they've been unable to sort of resolve this conflict for the past 5 years.
And so what emerged from this power struggle then? Like, who are the sort of contending political leaders upon independence from North Sudan proper?
Right. So you have so the peace agreement that was signed between Sudan and who has become South Sudan was signed with the rebel leader John Garang, who had an excellent relationship with the U.S. and was quite charismatic. Tragically, he died 6 months after that peace deal was signed in 2005, the one that led to South Sudan's independence. And he died in a helicopter crash in somewhat murky circumstances. And so this opened up a sort of a power vacuum within the South Sudan's ruling party. The guy who ended up replacing him is a guy named Salva Kiir, who's now the president of South Sudan. So he's still the president. There was also a power dispute that had arisen at various times in the 1990s. That was an ethnic conflict primarily between the Dinka, which is the group that John Garang and Salva Kiir, the current president, is from, and the Nuer, who's the second largest ethnic group. And the leader on that side is Riek Machar, and he's currently the leader of the opposition party, the main opposition and rebel group. And so these are the two leaders that then came together in Juba very recently as this peace celebration. But that's the main power struggle, and then you have a lot of other parties and a lot of other actors and many other ethnic groups in the country that we can talk about also.
And so Riek Machar was the vice president. He was basically fired, right, or sacked by Salva Kiir, and that is really what erupted the fighting in 2013.
Yeah, he was sacked. The fighting didn't break out immediately after he was sacked. There was about a 6-month period. But I would say the origin of this was he was sacked because of this power dispute within the ruling party, which was that Riek Machar, the vice president, was contending against the president for the chairmanship of the party. So out of that, and it wasn't just him, there was also other political leaders who were involved as well. And so out of that, Kiir ended up sacking him as well as other people, and then that just led to escalating tensions, which eventually broke out in clashes in the capital, and then everything quickly disintegrated and violence spread across the country because there was a massacre in Juba of the Nuer, the ethnic group that the vice president was from, and then groups in the Nuer mobilized very quickly, sort of for revenge, as well as the army itself, the SPLA, quickly split on ethnic lines, and it led to a massive civil war. Now, the other thing that I would say is that the dynamic that I'm describing very much describes the first 2 years of the war quite heavily, but since then there's been the war has spread to many other parts of the country, and involves many more groups. And so part of the question people have about this peace deal is if a political settlement just between those two actors is really enough anymore to actually end the conflict.
And I mean, it's worth emphasizing, though, that this conflict in South Sudan was one of the worst humanitarian crises, probably outside Syria. The second worst humanitarian crisis drove a lot of refugees over the border to Uganda and elsewhere, and took on really awful, as you said, ethnic undertones as well, displaced millions. But now, as you said, we have this peace deal. Can you talk a little bit about what this peace deal entailed? But first, sort of, how is it sort of now there is a peace deal? You said earlier that there was a failed peace deal earlier. What what forces aligned to inspire the parties to come together now in what seems to be a meaningful agreement?
Sure. Well, after the first peace deal collapsed, there was a period in time in which there was a hope that maybe people would be able to find a different way to resolve the war besides trying this same power sharing government again. And what led to the current new peace deal is, another year plus, over a year more of quite devastating conflict, and with really devastating humanitarian consequences, and really no political process that looked like it would resolve the war on its own. So there was then an effort, partly driven by the U.S. and Ambassador Nikki Haley, partially really put pressure on the government and the region to sort of renew peace efforts, and so we ended back up with another peace deal, another go at this. The peace deals are not totally similar, and they do. There was a lot of sort of shifts in the regional politics that occurred as well. The first peace deal was very much led by Ethiopia, and this recent one was pretty much brokered by the Sudanese with the Ugandans as well.
What did Nikki Haley do to push the parties towards peace that, say, like John Kerry didn't do the first time around?
Well, of course, the U.S. has been a strong actor on this from the beginning. John Kerry was very, John Kerry basically structured the way this peace deal is modeled in the very early weeks of the war. He struck this a deal that the conflict would end by President Kiir and Vice President Riek basically retaking their positions and then forming a transitional government to go to elections. The issue is that fell apart. That peace deal fell apart in summer of 2016, July 2016, and basically the Obama administration at that point never really formulated a new policy on how to handle South Sudan after that original peace deal collapsed. So then of course we entered a new administration. What Nikki Haley really did is she raised the issue and took on a much more hawkish tone than actually what the Obama administration had been willing to do. Prior had really amped up the rhetoric against the South Sudanese government. There's now been an arms embargo at the UN Security Council, which the U.S. Didn't always support originally. There's been a lot of targeted sanctions, but then she also flew into Juba and met with President Kiir and demanded he return to peace talks. So those sort of that sort of high level engagement, I think, really did make a difference.
And so, can you explain, what are the terms of this peace agreement that was signed, and when was the agreement signed, and sort of where are we in sort of the peace process?
Right. So the basic terms of it are that the rebel leader Riek Machar comes back. He becomes first vice president again, There are also 4 other vice presidents who are included in this deal, including 2 more from the opposition side, and then 2 appointed by the government. So you have this, increasingly kind of unwieldy, giant, bloated, power-sharing government whose main purpose is to just try to keep out spoilers from derailing this process. South Sudan is such a fragile state that it's very difficult and pretty much impossible for any government to sort of rule the country only by force. So there's a need for political consensus that they've had a really hard time achieving. And then this government, which hasn't been formed yet but is supposed to be formed, would then, in theory, lead the country back to elections. The core issue is that there's yet to be actually a political deal between these main parties that doesn't involve them just competing against each other, and continuing this power struggle all over.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, and what I mean by that is South Sudan's a place where it doesn't have one unified army. Each one has their own group. And in some ways, the mantra of, war is politics by other means. And in some ways in South Sudan, politics is war by other means as well. And so when they're heading to elections, the challenge is if you're heading to elections in a place that's really fragile, has a lot of trauma, and you have groups with their own armies basically competing against each other, and so twice now you've had basically power struggles between these groups lead to actual violence, and there's and the hope is that eventually these parties can kind of compete without turning to violence, but that's a difficult transition to make.
I guess how confident can we be that this peace deal will survive, given that it just sort of sounds like the deal is a lot like the way the government was before fighting broke out in 2013. That is, with Riek Machar back as vice president. I mean, his sort of expulsion, his sort of mounting a political and military campaign against Salva Kiir, and Salva Kiir returning in kind, left like 300,000 people dead, according to, the one estimate. How can we be sure, or do you have any confidence that this deal will survive in any meaningful way?
Well, Mark, you've raised a really possibly the critical point, which is everyone's been, the war has been so devastating that everyone's been just searching for any options to sort of halt it. And in many ways, people are just hopeful that they just get past this step one and just form this government and stop fighting. But then when you talk about how they resolve this deeper issue, which is that multiple groups want to rule, and there hasn't yet to be any accommodation between them, this gets at just the core structural issue, which is, South Sudan was formed a state. A lot of people would argue it formed a state without having really met the conditions beforehand institutionally. And so how to cross this bridge, how to sort of reverse engineer a state is a core question, and how to make it so that a group that's so diverse and no party's really able to win militarily, how to get them to share power more formally, I think is a really key question. I think something that needs to be given more thought is how to structure the political institutions in such a way so that all these parties don't see it as a winner-take-all fight for the center, which is really the driving dynamic causing this, is that everyone keeps looking ahead towards a power struggle in which only one party basically comes out on top, and that this current peace deal doesn't actually resolve that issue.
Can I ask you a little bit about like the political economy of this conflict in terms of the oil exports, which I take it are not really flowing at the moment, or they could be. I know for a while they stopped being exported. South Sudan has a lot of oil, but no real way to move that oil into international markets unless it passes through Sudan proper. So what's the status of that oil in the oil industry?
Yeah. So another answer to your previous question about what led to this current peace deal, and another answer to that question, besides the international pressure, is that regionally there's been a shift where South Sudan exports its oil through Sudan, and oil production has really plummeted throughout this war. Sudan profits quite a bit when South Sudan is pumping its oil, and the Sudanese economy is under crisis right now. So Sudan's president, Omar al-Bashir, very much pushed this current peace deal because he was hoping to get oil production to jump again in South Sudan, and therefore benefit both the South Sudanese and the Sudanese economy quite a bit. But when it comes to political economy, this is a core driver of the war as well, which is you have this winner-take-all political system in South Sudan. And when we say winner-take-all, we really mean winner-take-all, because there's almost no economy in South Sudan outside of the oil industry and the humanitarian industry. And beyond that, it's largely subsistence. So really, you have these political parties competing over who gets to monopolize the oil rents, and corruption is sky high, and pretty much the international community is providing everything that qualifies as a government service in the country.
So I mean, does oil revenue figure into the peace agreement at all?
Well, it figures in two ways. There's a formal way, and then there's the sort of informal political settlement way. I'll say the informal side of it is more critical, which is both the need to start pumping the oil again, and the shared interest there between the Sudanese president and the South Sudanese president. Is really the key dynamic that really shifted the region back towards peace, was this desire to get the oil pumping again. And that oil money in many ways is necessary on the South Sudanese side in order to, some people would say, create a patronage peace and sort of be able to afford to bring back some of these opposition leaders into a government.
Mm-hmm. Like basically buy them off sort of thing.
A buy them off sort of thing, which is how South Sudan kind of held together this government in the past before independence, as they got this wealth. They started receiving their oil revenue before they even achieved independence, and this is one of the ways they were able to sort of hold this political system together before reaching independence. And then there was an oil shutdown that occurred right after independence, which cut off the oil and kind of starved these patronage systems of funds, and a lot of the political tensions really started rising at the period. So some would argue South Sudan needs to get its oil pumping in order to fund this a sort of patronage system. Of course, that itself is hardly a great foundation to sort of build a state that. That still offers almost no services to its people. So it's not a very exciting proposition.
So maybe just to conclude, what indicators, events, or moves will you be looking towards that will suggest to you one way or another how this peace deal is evolving? Like, what will suggest to you that it's moving in the right direction, and what might suggest to you it's sort of moving in the wrong direction?
Well, in the right direction, it'll be whether or not they actually form this unity government. Because right now they had this peace celebration, but people have not come back and created this new government with 5 vice presidents. That hasn't occurred. The other one is that they agreed to unify the different armed groups in the country. So both the army and the rebel groups agreed to form one army. That is a process that's incredibly fraught, and almost no one thinks it will happen. But if it doesn't happen, it then becomes a question of how do you run this with government with effectively multiple armies in it. The obvious the things to watch out for are clearly that the parties keep on fighting with each other. Also, just kind of how they talk about it, their rhetoric. The challenge with a peace deal like this, which we saw when the previous one fell apart, is that it's sort of piling things back up again. So in some ways, you're piling more risk into the system, in as much as it can, when you put everyone back together again, it can also fall back apart. And that falling apart is also when most of the political violence occurs. It's a risky form. It's a high risk, high reward sort of peace process. So it's one of those you don't want to put too much. You don't want to push it too hard, because if you push it and it falls back apart, more people have probably died, and you're probably at a worse situation than you were before. So it's a really challenging balancing act for everyone who wants to help end this war, because they also don't want to make things worse in the process.
All right. Well, Alan, thank you so much for explaining this all to me and to everyone, and thank you for being a listener to the show and for reaching out.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Alan. I sincerely hope this piece of cord holds. And as I said at the outset of the show, please do feel free to reach out to me anytime. You can do so using the contact button on globaldispatchespodcast.com or hitting me up on Twitter at Mark L. Goldberg. And as always, a big thank you to the Global Development Institute at the University of Manchester for being an ongoing supporter of the show. We'll see you next time. Bye.